It's a double standard, and that's part of the hypocrisy that goes on. Now, with me in particular, and this is going to sound a bit egotistical, the reason that the attacks on me were so nasty and personal and vicious was because they couldn't say that I wasn't qualified. I was qualified. Therefore, I was a real threat. So they went and dug up these things about he's paid by the oil companies and he claimed that he's this and he's claimed that he's that. They falsified all of these things because they couldn't say I wasn't qualified. Now, that doesn't mean to say that nobody's entitled to opinions on things. The truth is the one thing we're all entitled to is an opinion. But again, we go back to that argument about what if somebody shows you that your opinion is incorrect, then you better be prepared to change your opinion. And I used to talk with the students about this. I said, look, if you take that argument about, well, you don't know all the information, therefore you shouldn't have an opinion, none of us will ever form opinions. But if you have an opinion and somebody shows you, no, look, here's some information you didn't know about, that should change your opinion. If it doesn't, then you are opinionated. The other part of what you're asking me about is, of course, the consensus argument, that if the majority agree, then you must be wrong. This argument came up very early when they argued, the majority of scientists. Well, who were they talking about? They were talking about the members of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now, that was originally 6,000 people. It very quickly whittled down to 3,000, and now it's 2,400 people or 2,500 people. Most of them, and I would say 97% of them, are not scientists, and 99% are not climate scientists. They're economists and they're demographers looking at the impacts of climate change once you accept that warming's occurring and it's going to be devastating.
The majority agrees on X, whatever the X is. In this case, it's, global warming. And now it's climate change is a problem versus a cycle. The majority agreed in Germany when there was a Holocaust to do things a particular way, to see things a particular way, to come from a particular paradigm of thinking. It doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it human. It doesn't make it acceptable. It just means the majority is agreeing on something. And the majority has been wrong before. Even that doesn't sway me.
Absolutely. And of course, what's interesting about it, as I've said many times, consensus is not a scientific fact. So consensus doesn't work in science, but it does work in politics. And of course, that's, to me, is proof of how this issue has become political when they start using the consensus argument. Einstein said it with science. He said, you can have 100 facts that suggest you're right, but you've only got to get one that suggests you're wrong, and it cancels all the other 100. Science, in terms of the consensus argument, is a completely different thing than the consensus argument. And of course, that's also how we get into ideas about groupthink, about how large groups of people are persuaded or go along, the herd instinct of humanity, and so on. And of course, that's why it was very easy for them, and by them I mean the group like Strong that organized this whole thing, to isolate those people that were saying, hang on a minute, I got some problems with this. Now, of course, that also thwarted the scientific method. And the scientific method is that a scientist speculates, and we've talked about this before, with a hypothesis or theory based on assumptions, and then other scientists immediately start trying to disprove it. It's what Karl Popper called falsifiability. But in the case of the global warming theory, they came out with the theory. They said, well, CO2 is a greenhouse gas trapping heat. It's going to increase because of humans producing it, and therefore the world's going to warm. It became a fact almost instantly. And those of us that dared to challenge it were called skeptics, when in fact all scientists are skeptics and must be skeptics. And then when the skeptic thing didn't work, because we pointed that out to them, but then suddenly we became deniers with all of the Holocaust connotations, which of course you just mentioned about. I first got called a denier in the Times of London about 8 years ago. But that was again a measure of how the politics side of this thing and the political machinations and weapons were used in this scientific argument. And by the way, Kim, an awful lot of scientists didn't agree with what was going on. For example, a few years ago, I spoke in Winnipeg, and there were Environment Canada employees there, and said afterwards, we agree with you, but we're afraid to say anything. And I said, look, I sympathize with you. You've got a mortgage, you've got kids, you've got responsibilities. This is your career area. But, at some point, people have got to be able to stand up and speak out. Well, what have we got? We've had to pass whistleblower laws to protect people that are going to stand up and say, hey, there's criminality going on here. And yet we've got to protect them in a free society? Doesn't the anachronism, the paradox of that hit anybody between the eyes? All of this, of course, as I said, is very cleverly exploited and was part of the whole deception that I happen to think is the greatest deception in human history, the whole global warming issue. By the way, just to add to your list, it's gone from global warming to climate change, and now Holdren and the White House have said it's climate disruptions. That's the latest term for
I'm
it.
sure. I want to talk to you about the 385 parts per million in terms of the carbon dioxide, where it is right now, and the optimal amount of carbon dioxide, which is 1,000 to 1,200 parts per million of where you think optimal plant life would be and human life would be. So my question to you is, the devil's always in the details, right? Both the revelation and the devil. So let's look at the devil. They're using carbon dioxide to tell us that we have to take it way below 385 parts per million, even though it's the lowest it's been in 300 million years, and make it lower. So let's say all the countries of the world banded together and decided to get rid of carbon that's being emitted from anything. What would it bring it down to?
We don't know. And not only that, you wouldn't be able to measure the difference. I've said on many occasions, if we took everybody off the planet and shut down everything and left one scientist behind and said, okay, you're left behind to measure changing levels of atmospheric CO2, she wouldn't be able to measure the difference. By the way, it's also been shown that you can burn all of the known reserves of fossil fuel and it would not double the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And so when we start to get into the details and the devil, this gives you an idea. And by the way, if we go down below 385, then the plant starts to suffer. At 250 parts per million, many of the plants are in serious trouble. And at 150 parts per million, most plants are dead. Because the plants produce the oxygen, then other life is dead on the planet. That's how critical maintaining levels of CO2 are to life on the planet.
How come people don't get that?
Partly because they don't know, partly because the mainstream media, which of course have the control over the public understanding of it, not only have they not reported it, but they've, as you've seen with those MSNBC stories and others, they've distorted. They've grossly distorted the information. It's all about education. And the science credit course that I taught for 28 years, I called it How the Earth Works. And I said, look, you're citizens of Earth. You're going to have to live on this planet. You better understand how it works because people are going to exploit your lack of understanding. And, of course, that's precisely what's happened, trying to help students not be exploited by their lack of knowledge. Say you're in a room at a conference. By the end of an hour-long session, because people are breathing out CO2, the CO2 level in that room can be 1,200, 1,500, even up to 2,000 parts per million, and it doesn't affect anybody. And to give you an idea, in a mine, the health and safety levels of CO2 in a mine, it can go up to 5,000 parts per million. Now, of course, they take very conservative lines, and they say if it's 5,000 parts per million, you can only be in that mine for 15 minutes, then you've got to get out. But that gives you an idea of how ridiculous it is to argue that 385 parts per million is problematic. And when you look at the 600 million year geologic history of the Earth, the levels for hundreds of millions of years are above 2,000 and 3,000 parts per million. So the arguments about 385 being very low, the other place they're making that argument about 385 is they're saying, oh, well, it's risen from the pre-industrial levels. Well, there's a guy by the name of Ernst Beck who just passed away this last year, an atmospheric chemist, incredible work that he did, and I was privileged to know from the time he started his research, and I warned him that he would be attacked nastily. But there were approximately 90,000 readings of atmospheric CO2 taken starting in 1812. Now, the reason was scientists were trying to determine what the gaseous makeup